I've owned both a 991.1 Porsche 911 Turbo S, and I currently own a 992 GT3. And I know when I was looking and when I was introduced into the Porsche world, I didn't know what the difference was. You know, I look at everything on paper was telling me, okay, buy the turbo. It's faster. And I think a lot of young guys, they will fall into the trap. More horsepower, straight line speed. And quite honestly, it was my dream car because that was the car for decades that, you know, lots of kids, you know, they would hang posters in their rooms and it would be a 911 turbo. GT3s really have, I would say in the last 10 years, have really changed the game for Porsche. GT cars are the more desirable cars. They're the ones that get all of the attention. So when I saw this, I don't know if it's a podcast, never heard of these guys, Speed Epic. There's this video. It's kind of funny because age is a number. It's a number to me, but it's all you know, relative. And I think, you know, if you're in your 20s, any man in his 40s and 50s is an old man to you, right? And I'm not sexist, by the way. I know plenty of women that drive 911. So, but I just thought this video was stupid. It's titled Porsche GT3 vs Turbo S, are 911 turbos for old men? And I look at these guys and, you know, obviously I look at them and, you know, relative to me, I think I look at them and they're old men. And it's just funny how they start off. Just take a listen.
Of which one you're taking home. See if you agree with me. GT cars all the way, old men drive turbos.
So that was the intro. GT3 cars all the way, old men drive turbos. So that's so funny that he's saying it because I think there's something in there that, you know, I don't know. I'm not at that age. I'm not going through some kind of midlife crisis, and I think he is trying to convince himself that he's cooler than what he really is. I don't know. And I think there's a misconception in the Porsche world. First of all, like, if you're coming from the BMW world or, you know, whatever your car community of choice is, there's definitely a lot younger car communities than once you get into these high performance, you know, sports cars. You know, in order to buy a Ferrari, to buy a Lamborghini, to buy a Porsche, when you're talking about, you know, $200,000 cars, and now we're talking about $350,000, $400,000 cars with the GT3 RS, the new one that just came out with all the markups, you have to be very successful. And obviously, you know, you're a college grad and, you know, you aren't making the big bucks yet. So you're young. What are you going to buy, right? You're going to buy your Mercedes, your BMW, your Mustangs, your Camaros, the general traffic. There's nothing wrong with that. I think what I tend to notice, because, you know, I consider myself middle age, right? I'm not going to say how old I am, but I think, like, compared to everyone around me in the Porsche world, I'm definitely a little, like, on the younger side. When I first got my turbo, I was definitely the youngest, but, you know, mid 30s. And I feel like for everyone out there, all the people in the car communities now, this is going to be a different video, and I might be rambling, but there's a crisis in the car world of straight line speed. And you can thank Tesla for this, you can thank all the EV cars for this, but I think we were already on a trajectory where everything was all about the quarter mile, 0 to 60 times. And that's kind of what I grew up on. So for me, when I saw the Turbo S on paper, and I saw the 0 to 60 time. I saw the horsepower figures. I was like, duh, why wouldn't you buy a Turbo S over the GT3? Like, who cares if it revs to 9,000 RPMs? That thing, there's just no way that you can compare to those numbers, 10-second quarter mile with a basic tune. Like, that's just insane. Why wouldn't you choose a turbo? So I got the turbo. I owned it for 5 years, and I did a lot of mods to it. So I'll throw some clips up and some of the modifications that I did. So first started off with basic, exhaust. I had a Soul catless exhaust, and I had to get a tune for it so I wouldn't get a light, check engine light. And I got the ES motor tune. I believe it was I'm going to screw this up. I think it was the 650 or the 700 ES motor tune. And it was more than enough. I mean, that car was the fastest car I've ever owned. I don't think you need more power than that. I mean, this again comes from like what's the car culture around you. And for me, I was definitely in the straight line speed club, right? So everything was about 0 to 60 times. I grew up in Massachusetts, where I think there aren't any good roads out there. But I'm in North Carolina now, and so when I started driving my turbo, I started taking it out to the mountains, the beautiful mountains around Tennessee, North Carolina area. Went to the Tail of the Dragon quite a few times, and even started a Porsche driving club locally here in Charlotte. And that's when things really started clicking for me. So the one thing I noticed coming from the turbo and getting into a GT3 is the agility, right? There's all this talk, like you get in a BMW M3, M4, even a 911 turbo, and the technology, like you gotta understand turbo lag back in the 80s, or back when turbos just first started coming out. Turbo lag was like dangerous. It was like Widowmaker dangerous, and that's why the 911 turbo gets that bad reputation. So for me, growing up on, that was kind of like the background noise, like turbo lag. And when you get into these modern turbo cars, you're like, oh my gosh, there's no turbo lag. This is great. But you really don't realize what turbo lag is in a modern sense until you get into a naturally aspirated car like a GT3. So this is kind of where I'm going to start getting into the actual difference between a GT3. So sorry if I've been rambling. So when you get into the 911 in general, like the feel of the steering, it's changed from going from a 997 to a 991 generation. I think we all agree that the steering in modern cars is just dying, right? As everything's becoming electronic, and you're not really getting a true representation of the road through the steering wheel. But I think in general, 911s and Porsche in general does an amazing job compared to the rest of the market. So for me, as soon as I got into a 911, like this was my first 911, I was just blown away. The response that you get through the steering wheel is amazing. So here's my gripe. Here's my problem with what most journalists say about turbos, because I got to back up the turbo here. It was my first. It's such an amazing car, and in the future, I think I'll definitely buy another one. But I think the problem is Porsche specs these out with some horrible tires, and as much as I love Formula One and Pirelli's the tire sponsor, Pirelli's aren't that great when it comes to my personal experience. I mean, you might have some great experience with a particular model or whatever, but the tires that Porsche puts on these, the P0s, are just, in my opinion, garbage. And I can confidently say that because I experienced it firsthand, like just for basically the first, 20,000 miles that I've owned the car. Or actually, let me back up. I think it was 10 to 15,000 miles that I was on the Pirellis. It was just a horrible tire. And I didn't know any better. I mean, for me, the performance was just already like leagues above everything I've ever driven. But I didn't know any better. And then as soon as I got into, Michelin tires, getting into 4S tires, I was just like, wow, okay, this is what a tire should feel like. And then the craziest thing, I'm going to put up the pictures of the modifications that I did to the front end. So the front of my turbo had two 295 front tires. It was a cup car modification. So what that is I took OEM fenders from a cup car and OEM flares from a cup car, and I put them on the turbo. So you get this huge gap. The wheels aren't flush anymore, so you need to get wider rims, wider wheels, and with that, wider tires. So it kind of squares up the setup. And the way I found out is there's this picture that I saw, Tail of the Dragon, this like slate blue turbo, and I'll post a picture of it. And I just started digging and I figured out that Autometrics in South Carolina had done this package called the Dragon Slayer. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to have that. So I did that. So with that modification, I had Cup 2 tires all around. I had 295 front wide tires, which that's like, if you don't know how wide that is, that's fat. Like the rear tires on the turbo were stock 305. So to have 295, and I believe the stock fronts were 255 or 245, something like that. And to go to a 295, it just was insane. The amount of mechanical grip that car had, like it was already all-wheel drive and it had amazing grip, but it was just on rails. The steering wheel did get a little bit heavier, and I felt like if the road was, had like little imperfections, it kind of carried the car a little bit more it pulled in one way or another. But that was under like normal day-to-day driving. And keep in mind, I didn't daily drive this. This was my weekend car, my fun car. So for me, it was definitely a game changer. I felt like that car, the amount of mechanical grip it had was just insane. And that's what it's going to come down to. So if you like modifying your cars, if you throw a good set of tires on a turbo, like all these journalists, they take the factory OEM spec tires, and then they'll compare it, to a GT3, and it's kind of like, maybe you should level the playing field and see what happens there, because the 911 the Turbo S will definitely beat the GT3 on certain tracks. So let me show you what I mean. So there's this car wow where Matt takes the Turbo S and the GT3 to Spa. And if you're familiar with that track, there are long stretches where the turbo definitely can use its torque, its power to gain. And I believe if you compare, let's see, just taking a look at my notes. So entry speeds on the GT3 were on average almost 4 miles an hour faster than the turbo. And I can believe that. With OEM tires, yeah, of course. With, a little bit more weight, I'm not sure about the weight difference. I think it's maybe, don't quote me on this, but it's probably like 400 to 600 pounds, somewhere around there in the current generation of Turbo S versus the current generation of GT3. So definitely the GT3 is lighter, has less mass. You can carry more speed, and those numbers, they make sense, right? 4 miles an hour faster. But on a straightaway, that's where the turbo just eats pavement. I mean, it's just like warp speed. It's like Star Wars. It's just so scary fast. So I could believe in this specific video with Matt Watson, the Turbo S was 4 seconds faster overall. So If you watch the whole video, I'll put all the links in the description. The Turbo S pulled a 244. The GT3 was a 248. So in this particular track, the Turbo won. If the Turbo had Cup 2 tires in a tune, it could have been another 4 seconds. I don't know. The problem is, and this is kind of where you have to kind of listen to all the inputs, and this is why guys have such a hard time when you first get into Porsche. I see this all the time. What should I buy? A GT3 or a turbo? Well, if you have to ask, buy a turbo. Like, no, it's not that easy. You can take a turbo and track the living daylights out of it. I took my turbo to VIR, abused the crap out of it, and drove it home. No problems, no lights, nothing. Like, these cars are just bomb proof. And for me, the one thing I realized, because like it's a learning experience and I'm sharing my learning experience, so I hope this helps somebody make the decision. But with the turbo, when you have turbos, you're gonna run a lot harder than a naturally aspirated engine. It's just common sense. Like, if you think about when you're starting a fire, the way that you speed up the fire is you introduce more oxygen, you introduce more air. That's literally what your engine is doing with a turbo. It's going to get hotter. You are packing it with so much extra air, right? That's what boost is. It's going to run hotter. So you have to upgrade your intercoolers if you want to track your turbo. And if you go to Renlist, there's an amazing community around tracking turbos on Renlist. And that's how I found out a lot of cool things about what you can and cannot do with a turbo versus a GT3. Like, for example, my car had Porsche's PDCC. So that's Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control, whatever. And it had PASM, I think, standard. But what that is, it's going to limit some of your upgrade capabilities with your suspension. So it's got a lot of bells and whistles. It's got a lot of like extra stuff for, I guess you can, it's not really like a gimmick. It really does help, but it's not really meant for the track. Whereas a GT3, you can go and adjust your ride height. There's more camber that you can adjust for. There's like Porsche literally built the GT3 for the track. So I think that is an important distinction. It's that you can, like, don't tell someone that you can't track a turbo. You definitely can, and you will definitely whoop a lot of GT cars on the track if you do it right. You have to have the right tires, you have to have the right setup, and you have to know how to drive, obviously. But I think for me, the biggest game changer is just the agility of a GT3. It just feels a lot more nimble. The throttle response, so this was huge for me. I thought, okay, like, driving the turbo, okay, there's definitely no turbo lag. There's no, like, I just floor it goes. I can modulate the throttle. There's no turbo lag. There's just no way. As soon as I started driving a GT3, I finally realized what turbo lag is. It's just, it almost makes the GT3 feel like an electric car. I've driven a Tesla Model S before, and that same instant response that you get with electric vehicles, that's how I would compare the difference between a 911 Turbo S and a GT3. It's just on another level, the response that you get from the GT3. So the other day, I raced a buddy of mine in a Turbo S. He was completely bone stock. And what I noticed is, okay, so he let me do the countdown. And obviously I knew I was going to lose, but we were probably doing like a 50 roll. And as soon as I say go, right, over the radio, just like, you can clearly see that advantage, right? So the GT3 pulls up probably like a car and a half, and then he has to reel me in. So he didn't pass me until I think we were at like 130, or maybe even more than that, but it took a while. So I think that's an important thing to note here, is that at speed, that power advantage that the turbo has, it's very minimal, and that's at speed. From a dig, heck yeah, the turbo is going to school me all day long. There's no doubt. But when you're on the track, when you're in motion, that's, I think, where the difference is. Definitely favor the GT3. So I do a lot of mountain driving. One of the things I noticed is I had to relearn how to drive the car. So right now I have about 3 or 4 mountain drives on the GT3, and on the Turbo S, I lost track. You know, I've owned the car for, I think, 5 years, and for me, I was like, I knew how to drive the car. And with the Turbo S, you have to modulate. When you hit the apex, you have to modulate the throttle, because on a turbo car, if you just floor it, you're going to go straight. You know, those front wheels are going to they're going to want to spin. And instead of completing the turn, you're just going to drift out. And if you don't time it right, you're just going to go beyond the curb, and you're just going to continue going straight and just do like this 4-wheel drift out of the apex. So that's why you have to modulate the throttle on a turbo, and especially when you have like 700 horsepower. Like, it's just, there's just no way you can just, you know, floor it. Now, with the GT3, I've noticed that I can get on the throttle earlier, and I can go deeper into the throttle. I didn't have to modulate as much. So if I were to draw a graph on, you know, how the power comes in, the turbo would be a curve. So as you increase throttle, you're getting more power exponentially. So it's not that it's harder to control, it's just that it's not linear. And that's an important distinction. The GT3 is very linear, right? So it's like, if I'm applying throttle consistently in a GT3, it's like, you know what to expect. Whereas in a turbo, this is kind of where I can see why the older turbos, right? If we're talking about like the 80s, the 70s, any turbo car, that's where the term turbo lag came in, right? Because it's like you don't know when that boost hits, and when it hits, it's like that exponential factor. So it's harder to modulate the power. So I get it. I love naturally aspirated. I have more respect for it. I've owned pretty much turbo cars my whole life. I did have a decent amount of naturally aspirated vehicles, and I've always enjoyed that instant throttle response. So for me, I think that's an important distinction. So all that to say, what do I like better? Well, I'm kind of biased now because I have a 992 GT3. I'm blessed. I think that it's wrong to blindly recommend one or the other. You have to decide for yourself what you want to do with the vehicle. If you live in Florida, where literally it's just straight roads everywhere, right? Number one, I feel bad for you. Number two, you might be better off in a turbo, right? So if that's your situation, then get the turbo. But if you like to hit the track a lot because all the roads are straight and you want that challenge of and the thrill of, you know, hitting the curves, then that's where you have to decide, okay, I still want the turbo, but now I need to modify it. I need more mechanical grip, better tires. I need intercoolers to keep the car cooler, because lap after lap, you're going to be running hotter than naturally aspirated cars. There's just no way around that. So definitely, I think we should, as a car community, not say stupid stuff like this guy that, you know, said old men drive turbos, because it's kind of the opposite. I see a lot more older guys driving GT3s. So that kind of wraps up my experience. This is just part one. I'm going to try to do some in-car footage of driving the GT3, and I'll actually put some in this video as well. I don't want this video to be too extremely long, but I think it's important to share this information. For me, the GT3 is an amazing vehicle. It's definitely more track ready. It doesn't make it better for the track, right? So if you think about the Porsche GT2 RS, that is literally a Turbo S with rear wheel drive with GT3 parts. So, and that car just blows everything else out of the water. So if you like modifying your car and you definitely want to experience straight line speed and also, you know, take it to the track here and there, the Turbo is the perfect car. If you strictly want to feel the naturally aspirated throttle response and feel that agile, you know, feeling through the steering wheel, because that's one thing I would also like to point out is the weight does make a difference. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're turning, it just feels so much more responsive. And I clearly remember the difference. Like there's a night and day difference. Like if I had to give them a spirit animal, I would say that the Turbo is a lion and the GT3 is a cheetah. I know that's kind of counterintuitive because you would think, okay, well, the Turbo is fast. Why wouldn't it be the cheetah? But if we're not talking about like a straight line race between the two, it's in the feel and the agility, right? So if you think about a cheetah, how it moves, how it's just so like agile and quick on its feet, that's the GT3. And if you think about the brute force and the power and the punch that a lion packs, that's the Turbo. And that's why it's still the king. I think like even like saying this, like I think it's the perfect like if you're only gonna have one vehicle for the rest of your life, it should be the Turbo. If you're going to experience, like if you're blessed enough to have a collection, obviously you go ahead and buy both. You know, if you have the means, go for it. And if you want to experience what it is to be, I guess, be a little bit closer to what Porsche, like the ethos of what Porsche is, then get a GT3. I think it's definitely a hard choice. And just like me sharing this information, like I'm just hearing myself, it's just like, wow, there's like, I can see why the younger me picked the Turbo. And I think the older me and the old man me now appreciates the GT3 because I don't care about the straight line speed. I'm blessed that I live by the mountains. I go almost every weekend, and you know, I go to the track a few times a year. So for me, I wanted that experience. It's not for everyone, right? So if you want to enjoy a little bit more comfort but still be able to do all that, the Turbo is a perfect car. So I hope this has helped you. I'm going to share all of these links in the description below. Stay tuned for part 2. You're not going to want to miss it. So make sure you subscribe, hit the bell icon for notifications. And yeah, I think if you're in this, if this is your first world problem right now, deciding between a GT3 and a Turbo S, congratulations. You're not going to go wrong either way. I'll talk to you guys later.